kitchen was still wrapped in the breath of dawn. Quiet, slow, honest. Steam rose from a kettle like a soft prayer, curling toward the ceiling as if searching for someone who still believed. On the counter, crumbs of last night's bread glimmered under the first light. Everything seemed untouched, suspended, waiting for the day to remember its purpose. At the small wooden table sat a boy, 4 years old, legs swinging above the floor, eyes fixed on nothing the adults could see. His mother stirred sugar into her coffee, distracted by the hum of the refrigerator. His father adjusted his tie, half in this world, half in the one that never listened back. Then, without prelude, without mischief, the boy spoke. He liked to help his father smooth the wood, he said softly, as though finishing a memory instead of inventing one. Both parents froze. The spoon stopped mid-circle, trembling above the cup. The father's breath caught between disbelief and instinct. Who, sweetheart? The mother asked, cautious, gentle. The boy didn't look at her. His gaze stayed steady on the sunlight falling over the wall. The one who laughed with Mary while she baked, he murmured. He said the dough was alive. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was sacred, the kind that makes air bend around a revelation. The mother swallowed hard. The father felt his pulse slow, the way hearts sometimes do when they realize they are not the only rhythm in the room. He looked at the boy, now tracing the grain of the table with his small fingers, whispering again. He wasn't older than me when he learned to make the nails round, so they wouldn't hurt the hands. A tremor, gentle and holy, passed through the kitchen. The clock ticked, unaware that time had just knelt. The parents exchanged a glance that wasn't fear, not yet, just the dawning sense that something ancient had spoken through their child. And suddenly, even the smallest sounds, the kettle, the clock, the sparrows outside, seemed to lean closer, listening. If you were there, if that voice had risen in your own home while the morning still smelled of coffee and warmth, would you have felt it too? Would your reason have remained calm, or would your soul have trembled first? Stay a little longer. Sometimes mystery speaks louder than reason. They lived on a narrow street where morning light learned to climb slowly. The houses kept their promises, porches that remembered shoes, windows that held the day like a careful breath. Their home was not grand and not starved. It was enough in the way a psalm is enough when sung honestly. Bills were paid with patience, soups stretched kindly, and the calendar on the fridge wore small pen-crowned circles like halos around ordinary days. The mother loved lists because they saved her from forgetting tenderness. The father loved repairs because they taught him how to listen to things that fail. On Sundays, they brought their silence to church and let the hymns name what they could not. They did not shout their faith. They kept it the way you keep bread warm under a towel. Grace before meals was not an announcement, but a turning of the heart, a simple, we receive. The child grew in that quiet grammar. He was serene, not because life was easy, but because he trusted rooms to be kind. He noticed shapes in dust, constellations in crumbs, the way spoons ring like bells when they touch bowls. He paused before staircases, patting the first step as if greeting a tame animal. When he spoke, his words arrived like pebbles dropped into water, small, clear, widening the circle in silence. He liked to sit near whoever was working. When the mother folded laundry, he nested socks with a concentration that made them look married. When the father sanded a board on the porch, the boy leaned against the doorframe, eyes tracing the arc of the father's hands, as if the air itself were teaching him. He did not demand attention, he gave it. Sometimes attention is the holiest work a soul can perform. Their town carried a faithful weariness. People waved without deciding to. The grocer knew the names of the faithful and the colors of their worries. The church, with its cracked parking lot and sanctuary that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old prayer books, held them together like a patient spine. The scriptures were read aloud. The silences were not hurried. The benediction always felt like a door opening from the inside. In this life of small obediences, the first strangely sacred situation did not shout. It came on an ordinary Wednesday when a chill had slipped in through the seams, and the mother baked bread to make the house remember summer. The boy climbed onto the chair beside the counter, elbows high, brow serious. He watched her hands knead, push, fold, turn. He did not ask to help. He did not pretend expertise. He only watched until watching became a kind of prayer. He laughed with her when the dough sighed, the child whispered, voice almost a smile. The mother glanced down, then away, then back, one of those glances that reveals the heart trying to keep pace with the world. Who laughed, love? She asked, gentler than caution, but steadier than curiosity. The boy's eyes did not leave the dough. The boy who made the wood smooth so it wouldn't hurt, he said. He liked when the dough remembered it was alive. The room did not change temperature. The kettle did not whistle in revelation. Yet a nearness stood in the doorway, patient as an old friend. The mother's hand slowed. She looked at the flour dusting her wrists like winter on olive branches and felt, without theatrics, the gravity of something that would not be reduced to a story. Another time, walking home past the hardware store, the father paused with the boy to watch a young man carry a long board awkwardly, one end scraping the sidewalk with a sound like a complaint. The boy frowned, reached a small hand toward the air, as if adjusting a weight no one could see, and murmured, "He learned to carry on his shoulder so the street wouldn't get hurt." The father laughed, then didn't. He looked down, and the boy was already watching the sky reflect in a puddle, satisfied. Small scenes gathered like dew. The child, unhurried before bedtime, traced the grain of the headboard and hummed as if the wood knew harmony. He would place his palm on the kitchen table and whisper, "This is a good place for crumbs," with a reverence that made even leftovers seem on purpose. He collected nails in a jar and lined them up by shape, declaring, "Round is kinder," as if he'd overheard the ethics of carpentry. None of this made him strange at school. He still ran crooked in the playground, still tripped on laces, still laughed at the surprising solemnity of pigeons. But the teachers noticed how he listened. When other children spoke, he faced them fully, as though their words were being woven, and he had been asked to hold the loom. When a classmate cried softly over a broken pencil, he cupped the shavings like seeds and said, "They remember." And somehow the child stopped crying. At home, the parents practiced discipline of not forcing meaning to arrive on schedule. The mother wrote down his phrases, not to prove anything to anyone, but because grace tends to evaporate from memory unless captured by ink. The father prayed shorter prayers, which is to say truer, asking not for explanations, but for gentleness, toward himself, toward his wife, toward the mystery that had begun visiting their kitchen at inconvenient hours. And still they asked themselves, was this simply imagination? Was it the echo of Bible stories read under blankets, the fog of a child's brilliant, blameless mind? They decided, without saying so, that the answer mattered less than the posture. If holiness wanted to borrow their son's mouth for a few syllables, they would not tighten their jaw. If holiness did not, they would still honor the boy's tenderness as a rehearsal for whatever God would ask him to carry one day. That first sacred situation unfolded further on a night of soft rain. The power flickered, the light surrendered, and the family lit a candle that turned the living room into a chapel that had forgotten its name. The boy watched the flame with monk-like seriousness. "He learned to love the hidden years," the child said into the hush, "because God likes when days grow roots." He blinked as if surprised by his own mouth, then yawned with hilarious humanity and asked for water. "You have felt shifts like this, haven't you? A room that turns toward quiet without asking permission, a sentence from a child that refuses to be filed under cute, a domestic task that begins to taste of sacrament. Have you ever stood in your kitchen and known, without evidence you could present to a skeptic, that the ordinary had been visited? Would you have named it? Or would you have protected yourself with a joke, a chore, a screen? You have seen children who command a room with noise. Have you seen one who changes it with calm? A child whose stillness widens the air, whose questions open a door that no one rushes to close? One who does not perform wonder but hosts it, like a neighbor at the threshold with bread in his hands? What if this is how heaven prefers to come, small enough to fit at your table, quiet enough to be missed by anyone unwilling to slow down? And what if the scripture's silence about those years in Nazareth is not a gap to be filled by rumors, but a sanctuary where reverence learns to breathe? You already know how the mother felt her palms become chalices, how the father learned that screws, like prayers, should not be over-tightened. You can imagine the boy asleep afterward, mouth slightly open, trusting the house to keep him. But can you imagine yourself there, between the kettle and the clock? When the child's voice berated the unseen with the actual, would you have felt your soul lean forward like a plant toward light? Or would you have busied your hands to protect your heart from trembling? You have met many kinds of children. You have met many kinds of mornings. But have you met a morning that asked for your shoes to come off? Have you met a child who did not need to be believed to tell the truth? And if such a child sat in your chair, drank from your cup, and told you that mercy has textures, wood smoothed, dough rising, water carried without spilling, would you let the textures become yours? There, in the smallness of a home that nobody would tour, the world before the mystery did not end. It ripened. The river of their faith ran as before, only now its surface reflected a deeper sky, and the quiet, no longer emptiness, never again absence, waited like a patient friend for whoever in that town would dare to listen. Rain had rinsed the town through the night, leaving the morning tender and rinsed of hurry. The boy woke easily, as if rest were a door he could pass through without catching his sleeve. He ate toast with the deep attention he gave to anything that became bread. Then, backpack on, shoes slightly mismatched in their enthusiasm, he stepped into a day that would widen the listening beyond the kitchen walls. On the walk to school, they passed the small carpenter's shed tucked between the bakery and a shuttered barbershop. The scent of wet sawdust rose like incense. The boy slowed, set his palm on the doorjamb with a familiarity that did not belong to him, and whispered. He liked when the wood sang under the plane. He said good wood hums when it finds its shape. His mother felt the sentence land where explanations fail and gratitude begins. She squeezed his hand. They moved on. In the classroom, the teacher set jars of buttons on the table for counting. Reds, blues, the occasional mother of pearl that caught the sun like mercy. The boy lined them up, not by color or size, but by smoothness, as if honoring which ones would be kind to small fingers. When a classmate grew frustrated, cheeks hot with the heat of being 6, the boy nudged a cool button toward him and said softly, "He learned to choose what doesn't hurt." The teacher glanced up, startled by the sentence's weight. She told herself it was precocious empathy, and left it there. Still, she found herself touching the mother of pearl and thinking of forgiveness. At recess, he sat beside a girl who refused to run. She stared at the chain-link fence as if it could pronounce her name correctly. The boy didn't ask why she was sad. He tore his sandwich in half and waited until her breathing remembered it belonged to her. He liked to sit with those who didn't want to play, he said eventually, looking at the ants organizing their bright ideas at their feet. He said quiet children make room for God to listen. The girl took the bread. In the teacher's window, a paper sun trembled as the air conditioner started. Everything, for a moment, was obedient to gentleness. The mother, who had begun carrying a small notebook the way some carry a rosary, wrote that line down later, quickly, before the day could dissolve it. She did not title the page. She did not draw conclusions. She left wide margins, as if holiness might want to add something later. That afternoon, they stopped at the market for eggs. Old Mr. Haddad, who boasted he could still lift 2 crates at once when his knee wasn't arguing with history, leaned on the counter and asked the boy if he liked stories. "He does," the mother answered, smiling, "but he doesn't collect them. They seem to collect him." The boy craned to see the open back room where crates made a maze of wooden decisions. He inhaled deeply. "He liked the storeroom smell," the child murmured. "Oil, olives, dust." He said dust teaches light how to be seen. Mr. Haddad, who had known Scripture longer than most, felt tears press without reason. "Out of the mouths of babes," he muttered, then cleared his throat and blamed the onions. On Wednesday evening, church gathered itself from the week's frayed edges. The sanctuary carried that weekday scent, lemon oil, old hymnals, damp umbrellas huddled like penitent pilgrims. During the quiet, before prayer, the boy sat between his parents and studied the altar rail as if it remembered something it had not told anyone. The pastor invited the congregation to give thanks aloud. There were the usual offerings: successful surgery, a new job, a stubborn reconciliation. The boy did not speak until the silence had rounded the edges of the room. "Thank you that you learned to wait," he breathed, not to be heard, only to be true. The words landed in the pastor's chest like a pebble in still water. Waiting, learned, loved, lived. He made a note for no sermon at all, only for the place inside him that still tried to hurry grace. At home that night, thunder stitched far-off hills together. The father stood in the doorway of the boy's room, arms crossed, remembering his own childhood. How faith had been a checklist sometimes, a schedule often, an inheritance always. He watched his son trace a small circle on the blanket, endlessly, as if reminding the fabric of its own softness. "Buddy," he said, voice steady as a plank placed where a step is missing, "when you say those things, where do they come from?" The boy did not fidget. He looked at his father the way some children look at windows, recognizing both barrier and view. "From the quiet that remembers me," he said. Then, after a pause that felt like obedience, "From a house that once held small hands and bread." The father's throat tightened as if a memory he had never lived was trying to get through. Sometimes the memories arrived as phrases that were not exactly memories, more like the echo of a footstep in a hall you've never walked. In the park, he paused by the water fountain and placed his fingertip where the stream arced into the basin. He learned not to waste it, he noted. He said water is like mercy, good to spill, but better to carry. On the bus, he brushed his palm over the frayed vinyl seat and said he liked when things lasted. In the grocery line, he stood behind a man with hands scarred by a life that had not always been careful with him and whispered he loved hands that told the truth. The mother sometimes asked questions, then trained herself to ask fewer. Yet one evening, with the dishes stacked and the table wiped into a sheen of gratitude, she could not help it. "When you speak about he," she ventured, "is it the one we read about?" The boy nodded, not solemnly but simply, like a child identifying a sparrow. "When he was little," the mother pressed, "did he ever hide?" The boy considered, eyes drifting to the window where a moth was giving itself a lesson in persistence. "He hid joy sometimes," the child said finally, "so others could find it." The mother covered her mouth with both hands, a gesture older than language. The father's questions, when they came, were blunt, not because he lacked reverence, but because he trusted it. "Did he ever make mistakes?" he asked on a Saturday, fixing a loose hinge that liked to confess its looseness every winter. The boy watched the screwdriver turn. Not the kind that hurts, love, he answered. He learned like everyone else, but he never learned meanness. The hinge settled into its rightness. The father set the driver down with a care that turned metal into liturgy. There were sentences the boy did not share with anyone but the floor, as if some words need wood beneath them to be safe. The mother overheard one as she passed the doorway, a whisper shaped like a smile. He loved Joseph's hands for being strong enough to be gentle. She kept walking so as not to pry reverence open with curiosity. In her notebook that night, she wrote only, "Strong enough to be gentle," and drew a small square, a sign to herself that this was a room to be entered later with bare feet. Not everyone understood. A cousin worried aloud that the child was being encouraged into strangeness. A neighbor suggested fewer Bible stories and more cartoons. The parents did not argue. Arguments would have reduced everything to winners and losers, when the truth felt more like bread being shared. They guarded the boy from eyes that feed rather than listen. They asked the pastor to stop by, not to certify, but to keep vigil. During one such visit, rain webbed the windows and slowed the town into honesty. The boy built a tower of blocks that looked like a ladder attempting to remember an older dream. "Do you ever feel heavy, little one?" the pastor asked, aware that revelation can weigh as much as it frees. The boy pressed a block gently into place. "He learned where to set the weight," he said. "He didn't put it where love would bruise." The pastor let the sentence sit like a lamp. He offered no cleverness. Holiness had already said enough. If your child spoke like this, small phrases cut from cloth you cannot name, what would you do? Would your heart believe first, or would your mind run from what it does not understand, calling it protection while fear quietly locks the door? Would you test the child until wonder hid from you, or would you let awe be the teacher and sit on the floor with it? One evening, power returned after an outage, and as the lamps glowed back to duty, the boy stood at the doorway between kitchen and hall. He liked this, he murmured. When light came back slow, it made people kind. The mother set down her dishcloth and leaned on the counter, feeling the home expand to fit a presence that asked for nothing and gave everything by simply being. The memories, if that is what they were, remained veiled, never parading themselves, never arguing for belief. They belonged to a humility that seemed older than the boy's bones and younger than his laughter. He did not claim to know secrets. He lived toward a silence that did not threaten him. His parents learned to live toward it too. And you? Where would you stand in such a house? At the window pretending to be interested in the weather? Near the sink, bargaining with your sense? Or at the table, hands open, willing to be addressed by a God who once learned to be small? If a 4-year-old told you that the Bible's quiet, has furniture in it, bread, water, wood, laughter, would your heart recognize the room? Or would you back away trying to keep your theology clean while your soul starved for crumbs? Perhaps the hidden years were never meant to be solved, only honored, an apprenticeship in nearness, a curriculum of ordinary tenderness. The boy seemed to know this without knowing how he knew. He returned from school with glue on his fingers, from the market with egg cartons drum-tapped into music, from church with a quiet that didn't ask to be named. And the house, blessed by unexplainable sentences and the courage not to use them, went on keeping time with the kind of holiness that enters by the back door, wipes its feet, and asks if anyone needs help setting the table. Nights grew longer without adding hours. The mother slept, but not the way she used to. Her body lay down while her heart kept the lights on. She would wake at 2:17, then again at 3:41. The digital clock a red catechism on the nightstand. She listened to the house, the old pipes clearing their throats, the refrigerator giving its faithful sigh, the far-off hush of cars like waves that never learned how to break. On those wakeful shelves between 1 hour and the next, she would press her palm flat against the mattress, the way one quiets a skittish animal and whisper into the dark, "Teach me to be gentle with what I do not understand." The father began repairing things that were not yet broken. He oiled hinges that did not squeak, leveled pictures no one had noticed tilting, planed the edge of a cutting board until it offered no splinter to any future hand. He did not call this anxiety, he called it stewardship. Yet he felt the truth inside the euphemism, a restlessness like a storm that doesn't choose a direction. He had no language for the feeling of being trusted by a story he had not applied for, so he turned screws slower, as if the metal could overhear his prayer. The boy did not change. He woke singing a melody that had more kindness than tune, lined up his cereal pieces like a small procession, kissed the window before leaving for school, so the light won't be lonely. He did not search the air for voices. He sometimes found them. His sentences, when they came, still arrived like notes slipped under a door. He did not push. He did not cling. He seemed to understand, without effort or instruction, that mystery is a guest who stays when not cornered. But the parents carried the weight. At dinner, fork paused between plate and mouth. The mother's eyes would film, no sobbing, just a tide rising. The father would watch her and feel the ache of helpless comprehension. He knew exactly why she was crying and exactly why he could not fix it. After the boy fell asleep, they would leave the bedroom door open a hand's width and sit on the couch with their knees turned toward each other like chairs placed for confession. "Are we doing right by him?" she would ask. "Are we doing right by him?" he would answer, capitalization hanging in the room like an unseen icon. They tried to speak without reducing. They tried to wonder without trespassing. The mother kept writing, but the entries shortened, distilled to one-line prayers. Guard his smallness. Teach us to carry water without spilling. Let us not merchandise what belongs to mercy. The father began to keep a different record. Not words, but finished kindnesses. He left a tool fixed and clean on the neighbor's porch, slipped an envelope into a church fund without his name, replaced 2 rotten slats on the park bench, and told no one. He needed to make rightness heavier than dread. On a Thursday, fatigue made a small tear in the ordinary. The boy, cheeks flushed with the heat of running, came home with a library book about birds. He climbed onto the sofa and went very still, the way he did when listening on the inside. The mother, sweeping crumbs, felt the air thicken, but not ominously, more like a river that decides to widen. He loved sparrows, the boy said softly, not because they were small, but because they were honest about it. The mother's throat tightened. She wanted to ask, did he ever get tired of being small? But the question felt like a hand reaching too quickly toward a skittish thing. She swept slower. "Thank you," she said instead to the room. That night she could not sleep again. She went to the kitchen and poured water, which tasted truer in the dark. She placed her palm, as the boy often did, on the table's warm wood. In that posture, a woman and a table and the honesty of thirst, she felt it. Not words, not pictures, just an unafraid nearness. It filled the room without taking up space. She cried, soundless, and the tears softened something that had been bracing against grace. When the father found her, he did not say, "What's wrong?" He said, "I know," and stood beside her, his hand near her hand, not touching yet, as if reverence had taught him a new etiquette. Their disagreements changed shape. They no longer argued about whether this was real. Reality had made itself at home. They argued about doors and windows. He wanted to shut the curious out. She wanted to open space for those who would keep vigil without stealing. Sometimes their sentences collided and the sparks stung, but more often they put the kettle on and let the steam remind them of what rises when warmed. "I don't want him to be used," he'd say. "I don't want this to be wasted," she'd answer. Then they would go look at their sleeping child, and the argument would curtsy to wonder and step out of the way. Exhaustion made them tender. The father, who had learned decisiveness at work, found himself practicing hesitancy at home, the holy kind that asks before it lifts. The mother, who usually had words ready, began offering silence as hospitality to the unsayable. They were changing not by willpower but by exposure, the way furniture takes on the scent of a house over time. The boy, oblivious to the calculus churning in the adult rooms, kept bringing the simplest offerings. At breakfast, he said gratitude makes things become themselves. On the sidewalk, he learned where shadows rest at noon. At bedtime, one hand on his mother's cheek, he liked when Joseph told stories with his hands. Each sentence threaded the parents tighter to the ache of reverence. Each sentence asked them to become a gentler kind of strong. Fear still knocked. It asked practical questions, with a voice that sounded like common sense. What if people notice? What if he is mocked? What if you steer him wrong? What if this ends, and you are left with only the ache of having once been near? The mother answered by lighting a candle and naming out loud every ordinary thing she could see. Spoon, sink, sponge, the bruise on the banana, the dent in the wall where a chair once scolded too hard. Naming, she found, is a way to say, "You are not alone." The father answered by fixing what needed fixing and leaving what didn't in peace, a discipline he had never practiced until holiness taught him restraint. On a Saturday, the boy asked to help sand a small shelf the father was making. The father hesitated. Tools and tiny fingers do not always share a truce, but the boy stood with the seriousness of someone who knows the difference between playing and participating. The father set his large hand over the boy's small hand and pulled the paper with the grain. The sound rose like a hush that can be heard. He liked this sound, the child said it's how wood prays. The father felt his own eyes burn, unexpected. He blinked and the tear fell, a clear bead darkening the dust. "I'm tired," he confessed, not to his son, to the room, to God. "I'm so tired of being careful wrong." Careful wrong. The phrase stayed. That week, he practiced a different carefulness, the carefulness of presence rather than control. He held his boy without scanning the horizon for threats. He held his wife without assigning her a role. He held the mystery without inventory, like a man who has been entrusted with a bird and finally trusts that open hands might be safer than a cage. The community could feel the tremor now, not as gossip, but as gravity. People lingered longer on the sidewalk outside their house, unsure why the air told them to slow. The mailman paused, pressed his palm to the porch post, and walked on with his hat in his hands. The neighbor with the loud opinions lowered his voice around dusk. No announcements had been made, no flyers printed, and yet the block learned a new politeness. They let the evening be itself. Through it all, the parents learned to bless their limitations. They could not decode the quiet. They could not predict when a sentence would arrive on the boy's tongue. They could not choreograph holiness, but they could set the table. They could turn off the television when the room asked for a gentler light. They could choose a slower walk to school, past the carpenter's shed and the market where olive brine baptized the air. They could invite the pastor to pray in a way that did not perform. They could say thank you before anything deserved it. One night, after the boy fell asleep with a wooden ruler like a scepter across his blanket, the mother asked, "Do you ever wish we could go back?" The father shook his head first out of honesty, then nodded out of memory. "I wish I could go back and be this kind," he said. She leaned into him. They watched the hallway breathe. A soft draft moved through the house, and the door at the end clicked against its frame. Not shut, not open, just truer. How many times does the divine pass between us, unnoticed because it wears the clothes of our own life? How many rooms have we left too early because the quiet asked for more of us than noise ever did? And when we finally perceive, when the veil thins not with spectacle but with a small boy's sentence about wood and bread, are we ready? Ready to be changed in ways that will not show up on paper? Ready to be known by a gentleness that reframes strength? Ready to keep vigil with a mystery that refuses to be used? If we are honest, we want God to arrive with certificates. But in this house, God kept arriving with crumbs. And the crumbs were enough to feed a family's courage, to retrain a father's hands, to anchor a mother's tears, to invite a town to walk slower at dusk. The mystery did not grow louder. It grew nearer. And the nearness asked for exactly what love always asks. Everything, but not all at once. News did not travel by rumor so much as by tenderness. A friend who sometimes borrowed sugar came for a cup and left with a quiet that she did not know how to carry alone. She told a cousin who told a deacon, who told Pastor Mateo one Sunday after the benediction, speaking not as a herald, but as a man placing a fragile bowl into careful hands. "There is something in that house," he said, eyes uncertain, hopeful. "Not a performance, a presence?" The pastor listened the way he always listened, as if the first task of shepherding were to become a field. He did not arrive with folders or a checklist. He arrived with a knock that asked permission to be sound. He came on a weekday afternoon, sleeves rolled to the forearms, a paper bag of oranges from his backyard in his left hand, because fruit disarms fear. When the mother opened the door, he smiled with relief, as though the door itself had been praying to be kind and had been answered. "May I come in and listen?" he asked. It was a strange sentence. It was the right one. The living room made room for him. He did not take the best chair. He sat where a child would sit, on the low ottoman near the table, nicked by 1,000 knives and 100 blessings. The boy watched from the corridor, not hiding, not presenting, simply measuring the new arrival as children do, by how the air behaves around a person. The pastor noticed the boy notice him and lowered his gaze with a tenderness that said, "I won't chase you. I'll wait where trust likes to grow." He began with small talk, because small talk, when it is honest, is a slow reverence. He asked about the father's work, admired the bookshelf the father had built that did not wobble even on this stubbornly uneven floor. He asked the mother how long they had lived here, whether the marigolds in the front had survived last winter's sulks. He placed the oranges on the table as if they were votive offerings to a domestic altar. Only then did he turn his full attention, like a lamp brightening by degrees, to the child. "I heard," he said lightly, "that you are good at noticing." The boy considered this as if weighing a coin. "Sometimes the quiet taps me on the shoulder," he answered. The pastor breathed in. There it was, the tone of it, not borrowed, not dramatic. He smiled, a smile that did not show teeth. "I like when it taps me too," he said. "What has it tapped you about today?" The boy's eyes went not to the adults, but to the tabletop, a faithful wood, sanded smooth by use and love. He laid his palm there, small hand, splayed like a starfish, finally home. "He liked tables that remembered crumbs," the child murmured. "He said crumbs are honest. They tell you that something was shared." The pastor felt the sentence enter him without asking permission, like bread that dissolves on the tongue. He nodded. He did not write anything down. He let the words find their own chair in the room. Pastor Mateo was curious, gently, frankly, the way a man is curious about the geography of grace. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice low. "When you say he, who do you mean?" The boy's head tilted, not confused, only surprised that a grown-up needed the obvious named. "The one who laughed at flour," he said. "The one who made the wood round so the hands wouldn't cry." The pastor swallowed. "Jesus," he said, "not as a test, as a recognition." The boy nodded, as if you had finally used the right nickname for an old friend. Curiosity asked its next good question. "And how do these knowings come to you? Pictures? Sounds? A feeling?" The boy looked toward the window where dust performed theology in a shaft of late light. "They arrive like when you remember a song, but only the part where the heart knows the words," he said. "Not loud, not far." The pastor's eyes warmed. He felt a tremor of joy, the particular joy of a shepherd who finds that the flock includes mysteries, not threats. He turned to the parents, not to interrogate, but to confess his own need for context. "How has this been for you?" he asked. The mother's smile was river and ache. "We are learning to be gentle with what we cannot manage," she answered. The father nodded. "I keep wanting to build a fence," he admitted. "But the ground refuses the posts." The pastor laughed softly, grateful for a metaphor that told the truth. "Then perhaps," he said, "we plant hedges of prayer instead, slow, living, not easily stolen." He asked if he might pray now, not over them, but with them. The boy climbed up onto the sofa next to his mother and folded his legs with monk-like seriousness. The pastor's prayer was unadorned. "Lord, if this is you, make us kinder. If this is not you, make us kinder still, so we will know you when you come." The room received the words the way fields receive rain, without analysis, with gratitude. Then the pastor did something that only real curiosity remembers to do. He let silence answer. 30 seconds. A minute. The refrigerator sighed and became a witness. At last, he spoke, softly to the boy. "Would you tell me one small thing about him that you love?" The child's face brightened at the word love, as if the question had chosen the correct door. "He liked to sit where people could find him," the boy said. "Not hidden, just near." The pastor closed his eyes, a single tear finding its own way. He did not chase it. He had no interest in performing either skepticism or wonder. He had come to be taught. Curiosity led him to a second visit, then a third. He came on different days, at different hours, as if to listen for whether the quiet kept the same schedule as grace. It does not. He brought nothing sometimes, soup sometimes, a book with pictures of tools that taught names without making anything sound like a test. He never announced why he was there. He allowed his presence to learn its reasons. In one visit, he asked a question that only a listener would think to ask. "Little one," he said, after the boy had placed 3 nails in a row and decided they were a family, "was he ever bored?" The boy's eyes widened, as if the pastor had offered him a secret handshake. "He liked bored," the child said. "He said it gives the heart time to choose kindness on purpose." The pastor chuckled, a sound of recognition rather than amusement. He wrote that down later in the only place he allowed himself to keep notes, the margins of his own soul. The pastor's curiosity was not nosy. He guarded the holy by asking questions that respected its shy temper. "What makes him laugh?" he asked one afternoon, after watching the boy press his ear to the side of a loaf cooling on the counter. "When people share badly," the boy answered after a long, happy pause. "He laughs and fixes it." "How does he fix it?" "He gives them more to share." The pastor felt the gears of some long-sitting sorrow loosen inside him. He also asked the parents careful things, how the nights were, what fear said, what hope argued, whether the boy seemed tired after these statements. The mother confessed the wakeful hours. The father admitted the temptation to move to a different town and bury the story in a safe anonymity. The pastor nodded with a face that could carry the word understand without needing to say it. "Let us set boundaries that are not walls," he suggested. "No cameras, no crowds. If anyone comes, they come to sit, not to see. And the boy is never asked to perform the holy, only to be loved in it." On a rain-polished evening, the pastor brought a small wooden box from his own childhood, a thing simple and square, lid sliding with a sound like a memory returning. "My papa kept nails in it," he told the boy. "I kept prayers." He placed it on the table and slid it open, empty, on purpose. "Would you like to keep anything in here?" The boy placed a single round nail inside, then shut the lid with the ceremonial gravity of a child doing something deeply understood. "Round is kinder," he whispered. The pastor bowed his head because there are sacraments that happen without clergy. Curiosity sometimes brought tears. In one visit, while the father sanded a shelf with the deliberate patience that had become his new language, the boy watched and said, he loved Joseph for learning to be strong without being loud. The pastor felt his own father, gone 20 years, sit down beside him, invisible and faithful. He wiped his eyes, unashamed. "Thank you," he told the child. He meant it the way a thirsty man means water. He asked, gently, about fear. "Does anything frighten you, little one?" The boy considered. "Loud meanness," he said. "It makes the air hide." Does he ever feel far? The pastor ventured. The boy smiled as if at a common mistake. He hides near, he said, so we learn to look kindly. The pastor laughed at himself, loved by the correction. He was learning a new map, where nearness is not noise. The pastor's curiosity began to reshape him. Sermons shortened. He let silence do part of the preaching. In counseling, he asked fewer questions that sounded like ladders and more that sounded like chairs. In prayer, he stopped trying to get God's attention and asked for help paying attention to God. He told no one about the boy beyond what was necessary to protect the family. His curiosity had become loyal. One afternoon, he found the boy in the backyard arranging pebbles in a curve that hugged the garden bed. A road? The pastor ventured. A shoulder, the boy replied. Roads need places to cry. The pastor sat down in the grass like a student. What did he do when the road cried? He walked slower. The pastor had never loved a theology more. He made one mistake and it taught him. A visiting friend from another church, a good man who loved evidence the way some love poetry, asked to tag along. The pastor, against his own intuition, said yes. The friend sat forward, eyes bright with hunting, pen ready. He asked the boy 3 questions in one breath. The boy went quiet, not shy, not wounded, simply gone to the place children go when adults lean too hard on wonder. The pastor felt the air wilt. He ended the visit early and walked his friend back to the car under an apologetic sky. You can't pick fruit from a tree by shouting at it to ripen, he said gently. The friend flushed, embarrassed, grateful for the correction. Forgive me, he murmured. The pastor nodded. Forgive me first, he answered. I should have guarded better. After that, he clarified the rules to anyone who asked to come. No questions that prove you are smart, no eyes that want to be filled more than they want to bless, no taking, only receiving. Curiosity must be baptized into kindness before it is allowed in the room. When the pastor finally asked the question that had been warming in him for weeks, he asked it like a man asking for bread, not a man demanding proof. Little one, he said, what did he learn in those hidden years that we forget most? The boy did not answer right away. He studied the pastor's hands, the map of a life of holding, bearing, marrying, blessing, then placed his own small hand upon them. He learned to be findable, the child said. We try to be impressive. He stayed findable. The pastor closed his eyes, and the prayer that rose in him had no words, only a new willingness to be small. He left the house that day and walked a long way back to the church, past the carpenter's shed where the scent of cut wood preached an unashamed sermon, past the market where olives taught the tongue about mercy, past the bus stop where a tired woman rested her forehead against the glass and did not know she had just leaned on a psalm. He carried with him not a story to tell, but a posture to live. The boy's lines had not given him answers. They had given him furniture for the silence. Would you have the courage to look a child like that in the eyes, not to examine him, but to accept being seen? Or would you lower your gaze, afraid that the holiness you hope for might recognize you first? Curiosity can be a thief or a midwife. In this house, under this roof, with this pastor's patience, curiosity became the kind that helps birth. No force, only breath, only timing, only the gentle insistence that love not be hurried or handled with gloves too thick to feel. Before he left each time, the pastor would ask the same simple question, because rituals teach the heart to expect God. Is there anything you want me to remember? And each time the boy answered differently, but with the same center. Thank the table, once. Walk slower on crying roads, another. Round the corners so hands won't hurt. And finally, on an evening when the sky bruised purple and healed into gold. Be findable. He repeated it to himself all the way home. Be findable, until the church doors, when he opened them, felt like they had been waiting for exactly that. He stepped into the nave, no candles lit, no music rehearsed, and sat in the last pew like a man who had just learned how to kneel again. He did not plan a vigil, not yet. He planned to listen, because the mystery had found a house with a table, a boy with an unafraid mouth, parents with trembling courage, and now, perhaps, a pastor whose curiosity had finally been christened into reverence. It began like weather that changes the light before it changes the sky. The street did not become holy, it became attentive. Dogs stopped barking a heartbeat earlier than usual. Wind chimes, hung for decoration, started sounding like memory. Neighbors, on their porches with mugs and errands, found themselves pausing mid-sip as if a forgotten hymn had stepped out of the alley and cleared its throat. Small signs gathered with the gentleness of dew. Mrs. Alvarez, who watered her geraniums each morning with the concentration of a nurse, reported the first one without drama. I kept smelling fresh-cut wood, she told her sister on the phone. But no one was working. Then the scent turned warm, like a bakery at 5 a.m., and I felt seen. She didn't say blessed. She didn't say miracle. She said seen, and her voice found a softness that had been missing since her husband's winter death. At the market, a pallet of flour tor and fine powder lifted into the aisle like pale incense. A clerk moved to curse, and then did not. He watched the dust catch sun through the open back door. He heard, or thought he heard, the smallest sigh, as if the room had exhaled after holding its breath too long. He carried the broom slowly. The dust teaches light how to be seen, he told his coworker without knowing he was quoting a child he hadn't met. The coworker blinked. That's pretty, she said, and the broom moved like a prayer. The mailman had the second sign. He'd been delivering envelopes here for a decade, recording the town's joys and debts in the tilt of his bag. One Tuesday he climbed the steps to the family's porch and felt an ordinary warmth move across his chest, calm and bright. Not a shiver, not heat, like a hand that didn't need to touch to comfort. He stood with his cap in his hands, hat brim a small altar. Later he told his wife, I had the sense that I'd been looked for, like the porch was waiting for me. People began to dream. Not spectacular dreams, no angelic visitations, shouting commands, only dreams that left a residue of peace and the odd detail that proves itself by not being important. A nurse dreamed of a table nicked by knives and love, crumbs glowing faintly like embers. A mechanic dreamed he was smoothing a splinter from a board, and somewhere a child laughed softly because round is kinder. A teenage boy dreamed he sat on a doorstep with someone who did not need a name. They shared bread and the night's worries until the worries forgot to be large. He woke and apologized to no one in particular for being unkind the day before. The scent of wood and bread showed up where it did not belong. In the laundromat between two sour machines, in the school hallway outside the principal's office, on the third pew from the back, where a widower kept his aching silence. More than once, a person walking past the family's home felt compelled to take off their cap, or, without knowing why, to walk a little slower, as if the sidewalk had become a shoulder where roads go to cry. No one claimed a phenomenon. The town was too practical for that. They kept their language small and accurate. It felt kind. It felt honest. It felt near. Curiosity, baptized now into something gentler, brought visitors who knocked softly and brought simple gifts. A woman left a sack of oranges and a note that said, "For the table that likes crumbs." A carpenter whose hands had been faithful to 1,000 unremarkable repairs left a bundle of sandpaper grits tied with twine. For rounding what hurts. A retired baker stood across the street and watched the family's window glow at dusk. When he finally met the boy on the sidewalk, he did not ask a single question. He only said, "Thank you for liking dough." And the child grinned as if congratulating the man on telling the truth out loud. Church felt the widening first. Pastor Mateo, curious, patient, unwilling to harvest a story before its season, noticed the prayers of the people shortening and sweetening. They were less about outcomes and more about nearness. "Thank you for waiting with me," someone said on a Wednesday. "Thank you for teaching me to be findable," another whispered at the rail. The pastor had not preached those phrases. They had arrived on their own feet, carrying the fragrance of wood and bread. Small coincidences arranged themselves like an alphabet anyone could read if they didn't hurry. Lights flickered not with menace but with courtesy, dimming at the end of a hymn as if bowing. A long feuding pair of brothers discovered in the same week that they were both tired of being right. They shook hands in front of the market, and a gust of wind sent flour dust from the back room into a small sunbeam above their heads. An elderly neighbor who'd never liked children began leaving chalk on the sidewalk, colors lined like crayons in a tin, and no one asked why. The boy did not perform. He tied his shoes badly, spilled his milk sometimes, stared too long at the way puddles copy the sky. But wherever he went, the signs followed like patient doves. In the library, the air near the wooden tables smelled suddenly of olive oil and old stone, and the librarian, who had kept order for 25 years with the stern mercy of a saint, softened her whisper and set a bowl of peppermints closer to the edge. "Findable," she said to herself, and didn't know why she chose the word. Some people resisted. It's hard to accept a change that asks nothing from you except attention. A man whose business depended on hurry scoffed in the bar. "So, the kid's a prophet of crumbs?" The laughter that followed was brief and embarrassed. Even in mockery, something held the room back from cruelty, as if meanness had to lower its voice in this part of town or risk turning red under a gaze it could not see. The man went home by a longer route, and later, without explanation, apologized to his wife for the week he had been hard to love. Stories braided themselves into a consensus you could smell more than prove. A teacher stopped by the house, and, after a cup of tea, asked if she might sit a while without talking. She listened to the refrigerator and the rain in the gutters and left as if a knot behind her eyes had loosened. A bus driver, passing the corner at 7:10, said he caught sight of the boy and of the pastor sitting on the steps with their elbows on their knees as if they were practicing being ordinary on purpose. And he felt the bus grow quiet around him, even though no passengers had boarded yet. Peace got on, he joked later to his route partner, but the joke carried its own amen. Softer confessions surfaced, not like stones thrown, but like shells offered. A mother admitted she was afraid of how much she loved her daughter. A college kid confessed he had started saying grace over his coffee at dawn, not because he was pious, but because gratitude had begun to happen to him. A man stood at the edge of the park, looked at the bench with the newly replaced slats, and wept because he realized someone had made a place soft for the back of a stranger. The pastor guided the flow like a gardener who refuses to pave. He set simple boundaries. No cameras, no tests, no crowds without faces. If you came to the house, you came with your shoes cleaned of spectacle. If you wrote about what you felt, you wrote as a witness, not a judge. He reminded the town, this is bread, not bait. People nodded. They understood more than they admitted. The mystery, like a deer at the edge of a field, would keep coming if no one tried to run at it with loud certainty. Not all the signs smelled of wood and bread. Some sounded like mercy. In the schoolyard, a fight that would have been inevitable chose not to happen. Two boys, breath hot with pride, noticed the small sister of one watching from the fence and stepped back at the same time. In the hospital, a night shift nurse hummed while checking drips. A patient in the next bed recognized the hum from a dream she had had the night before, a tune that had no notes, just kindness. In a kitchen 3 streets over, a grandmother teaching her grandson to knead dough found the boy's small hand placed on top of hers, and she whispered into the flour, "Thank you for making me patient," as if the dough were listening. And the house itself, ordinary, a little stubborn in winter, faithful in summer, learned to host the town's fatigue. People would stand on the sidewalk and exhale. They didn't knock. They didn't need to. The porch held their tired like a pew that does not ask your name. Sometimes, at dusk, the front window would throw a quiet gold across the street, and the gold would smell faintly of olive wood. A passerby would feel compelled to speak into the air as if the air were taking notes. "I'm trying to be kind," they'd say. "Keep trying." The air seemed to answer by not leaving. The boy, invited sometimes to other houses, carried nothing except his small self. At Mrs. Cho's, where the kitchen clock had ticked too loudly since her husband's stroke, it clicked softer for one evening. At the community center, the fluorescent lights lost their cruelty. The custodian said, bewildered, "They're the same bulbs," and decided to stop swearing at them. In the barber shop, a toddler sat without screaming, and the barber, hands steady from 40 years of work, felt suddenly that he belonged to his city in a way he had never named. You could miss it, of course. You can miss anything that doesn't demand to be seen. But those who slowed, those who let the scent of wood and bread interrupt their day, found themselves walking differently. They rounded their words. They put shoulders on roads. They left room at their tables for crumbs to tell the truth. Something had been shared. Has your heart ever recognized something before your mind could understand? Have you ever walked past a simple house and felt your pace change, not because of fear, not because of awe, but because you sensed the world had remembered how to be near? If you smelled bread where there was no oven, if you felt your hands want to be gentler for no new reason, would you call it coincidence? Or would you risk the quieter word, the one with fewer syllables and more trust? The town did not hold a festival. No banners, no slogans. They kept going to work. They kept caring for parents and mending fences and paying bills and letting their dogs tug at leashes. But the common life brightened with a grace that did not brag. The hidden years of Jesus, those pages Scripture holds like a closed fist, seemed to open not with information but with atmosphere. A kindness that entered rooms like light through worn curtains, a patience that rounded edges, a nearness that smelled like wood and bread. And the community, without deciding to, began to practice what it had perceived. Be findable, walk slower on crying roads, round the corners so hands won't hurt. Leave crumbs because nothing shared is lost. No one issued these as rules. They passed from palm to palm the way warmth does, unseen, indisputable. The oldest news of all returning to a town that had been waiting without knowing it. They chose a weeknight because Sundays already carried too many expectations, and Saturdays were loud with errands. Wednesday, plain, middle, trustworthy, offered itself like a clean plate. The pastor asked for no flyers, no photographs, no testimony time. "A house can hold only so much attention," he said, "and attention is heavy when it wants to eat." So they came in 2s and 3s, shoes quiet on the porch boards, palms open to nothing in particular. The living room, faithful veteran of birthdays and fevers and homework battles, took a breath and made space. Chairs formed a loose circle that refused to become an audience. On the coffee table, a loaf of bread, not ceremonious, just honest. A clear pitcher of water wearing a small halo of condensation. 2 mismatched cups. The lamp in the corner lowered itself to a dusk you could touch. Windows held the neighborhood in their glass. Porch lights blinking like slow eyelids. A stray cat conducting evening rounds with the dignity of a monk. No one began. Beginning would have sounded like ownership. People simply found their seats and let their breathing synchronize until it was one animal with many hearts. The mother sat with both hands resting on her knees as if her body were learning a new prayer that started with staying. The father kept watch the way shepherds do when they finally trust the hillside, not scanning for wolves, only agreeing to be awake. The pastor placed his feet flat on the floor and did the bravest work a leader ever does, nothing. The boy sat cross-legged on the rug, socks patterned with stars, a smudge of graphite on his thumb. He did not look like a hinge on which heaven might swing, but sometimes hinges hide their strength inside smallness. He studied the grain of the table as if it were reading to him. People waited, not with hunger, but with courtesy, as one waits for an elder to find the next word. The waiting grew thick, not tense, not thinly fragile, but substantial, like bread rising under a towel. Someone coughed and became embarrassed by the sound. In the kitchen, the old refrigerator changed registers, with a sigh that sounded almost relieved. The neighbor who had brought the oranges last month folded her coat on her lap as if tucking a child into bed. A teenager, long accustomed to the itch of skepticism, found himself strangely unitchy and didn't know what to do with his hands. Time made a small apology for its usual hurry and slowed its feet. The pastor cleared his throat, not to speak, but to ask silence for permission to stay a little longer. Then he offered the only sentence he had rehearsed. "We are here to be near." It landed with no splash, like a stone placed into an already built wall. He didn't pray aloud. He let the room pray him. The boy lifted his head the way plants do when the sun remembers a window. He did not stand. He did not arrange his face. He placed his small palm on the table and kept it there, as if greeting an old friend whose wrist pulsed beneath the skin of wood. He looked at the loaf. He looked at the water. His voice, when it came, was small enough to pass beneath doors. "He learned to be small," the child said. The sentence did not go around the circle. It went through people, to the places where complicated beliefs keep their coats. You could watch shoulders lower by half an inch. You could watch jaws unclench the way fists do when they remember what hands are for. The child did not hurry. He drank the quiet as if it were room temperature and perfect. "He learned to be small so no one would be afraid to come near," he added, eyes still on the bread. He practiced being findable. A woman who had not cried since her brother's funeral 2 years ago found her eyes obeying a simplicity that did not ask her permission. She did not cover her face. She did not apologize to the air. The tears made their own liturgy down the paths grief had mapped and healing had been waiting to use. The boy's fingers moved lightly across the table's curve. He liked to watch his mother knead, he said, his mouth shaping the memory like dough. He said the dough is a world that needs gentle turning. He closed his eyes, smiled a little, as if the smell of warm flour had entered the room from a kitchen no one could see but everyone could remember. The mother pressed her heel to the floor, grounding herself against the kindness of it. No one asked follow-up questions. The pastor, who had learned the difference between curiosity and custody, kept his questions in his pocket like a knife he had vowed never to open in this house. A boy in the corner, not the child, but another boy who had come with his grandfather, whispered, "I feel quiet." And the grandfather nodded, "Me too," as if quiet were weather they could both stand under. The child's voice returned, barely more than breath. "He thanked the small things before they were big," he said. "Thank you to the board before it became a table. Thank you to the water before it became a cup. Thank you to the day before it decided what it was." The father shut his eyes as if a splinter he had lived around for years had just worked itself free without blood. The air deepened, not heavier, not lighter, truer. The kind of air that makes you aware of your own breathing, the way you become aware of your name when it is spoken from the doorway by someone who loves you. No shiver, no glow, no gust through the curtains, presence without theater. A stillness that did not demand anything and therefore drew everything. The boy glanced toward the pitcher. He lifted it with 2 hands, because reverence is often simply using both hands, and poured an inch of water into one cup, then into the other. He set the pitcher down with the ceremony of a child who understands that sound belongs to the moment. He said gratitude helps things become themselves, he murmured. The pastor did not move to take a cup. He waited. The waiting itself seemed to taste like water. Across the room, someone began to laugh softly, not at humor, but at recognition. The laugh of a person who has found the missing key in the pocket they have checked 3 times. Another person answered, not with laughter, but with the exhale that finishes a long-held sob without needing the storm. Shoes settled. The floor remembered how to be floor. The house, loyal and proud, held. The child's eyes lifted to the circle for the first time, and he looked at each person as if memorizing the way their faces belonged to them. He said, "Hiding is for hurt," he whispered, "but smallness is for love." The words hung there, simple as bread. No one tried to trap them with explanation. No one reached for a pen. They let the words choose their own homes inside them. Minutes or decades passed. The pastor finally spoke, not to add, but to trace the outline of what had already arrived. "We receive," he said. It wasn't a formula, it was a posture. People nodded with their shoulders. The boy placed his palm again on the table and left it there. He did not close his eyes this time. He looked at his mother's hands resting open on her knees. He loved hands that told the truth, the child said, strong enough to be gentle. The mother's fingers trembled with the dignity of being seen. The father, whose strength had been apprenticed to control for years, felt a new apprenticeship proposing itself. Gentleness as a craft, smallness as a trade, presence as work. A long quiet followed, the kind that plants things and later finds them rooted. No one fidgeted. Even the necessary discomforts of bodies, the itch on a calf, the chair that pinches, the throat asking for a swallow, seemed to understand they were guests and behave accordingly. Outside, a car passed and did not break the moment. A bird made an ordinary sound, and it did not become a sign. It remained a bird, and that was miracle enough. When the child spoke again, it was a sentence that brought the evening into a single living point. He did not rush the hidden years, he said. He let them ripen him. The words, naked of drama, walked into the room and sat down like a relative with hands that smell of bread. The pastor inhaled a breath that reached places he had been too busy to ventilate. The teenager pressed his knuckles to his eyes and then didn't. The widow let her shoulders finally meet the back of her chair. The house learned a new creak that sounded like gratitude. There was no finale, no curtain to close. Presence does not end. It remains, and we remember. The child lowered his hand from the table and leaned, without announcement, into his mother's side. The mother exhaled a blessing without words into the boy's hair. The father reached for his wife's knee and found it, and finding it was enough. The pastor did not declare a benediction. He let the room find its own. In the corner, the lamp kept its small, obedient light. At last, the pastor spoke the only instruction he trusted. "Let us not explain this," he said. "Let us keep company with it." Heads nodded. Someone whispered, "Amen," not as an end, but as a door that stays open. They remained. People did not rush to stack chairs or wash cups or thank the hosts with language that would have turned the evening into an event. They lingered at the boundary between silence and the lives that would need to be lived again tomorrow. The loaf sat uncut, and this felt right, as if slicing would have tried to divide what had arrived whole. The water waited, patient as always. The night moved forward without insisting on punctuating itself. One by one, quietly they stood, a hand on a shoulder, a look that said "me too" without broadcasting need. Some touched the table as they passed, not superstitious, only grateful. Thank you for being wood, for being a place, for receiving our elbows and our tears and our breath. On the porch, cold air met warm cheeks and did what it does best, told the truth about seasons. People put on coats and hats with ceremony they didn't intend, like acolytes donning vestments, and walked into a neighborhood that had not changed and would never be the same. Inside, the family moved with the slow precision of those who have just received expensive glass and know better than to set it down fast. The father lifted the loaf and returned it to the bread box as if storing a relic that was still bread. The mother poured the 2 inches of water from both cups back into the pitcher, kissed the rim, and only afterward laughed at herself and kissed it again. The boy collected a crumb from the table, one crumb that had become a thesis, and pressed it into his palm until it learned his heat. He left it on the windowsill, an altar no one would dust. The pastor remained last. He looked at the boy and asked the same departing question he had learned to trust. "Is there anything you want me to remember?" The child tilted his head as if listening to the floor decide, then answered, "Be findable." The pastor smiled with his whole face. "We will try," he said. He did not bless with hands. He blessed with presence, which is the older sacrament. The door closed. The night gathered itself. The house, loyal as ever, returned to its ordinary. Dishes, a light switched off, feet on stairs whose wood had been rounded long ago by the right kind of use. Yet ordinary had shifted its weight onto a different route. Silence did not end. It moved into the walls. And you, if you had been there, what would you have done with that kind of quiet? In the hush, where God becomes as local as bread and as unhurried as water, would you have heard? Would your fear have tried to speak louder, or your love learned to whisper better? In the stillness where the holy chooses to be small enough to be near, would you have trusted smallness to save you? The night kept its answer. The room kept its shape. The family kept the door they could not name ajar. And the presence that had refused spectacle stayed, unannounced, unmistakable, like a hand on the shoulder of a town that had finally remembered how to stand still. Morning returned as it always does, but now the light behaved differently. It entered rooms as if asking permission. Even the dust floating through the air seemed to understand it was part of a larger calm. The boy woke early, as was his habit, but he no longer hummed the songs that sometimes arrived unannounced. Instead, he listened. To the refrigerator's sigh, to the soft wing beat of curtains, to the faint breathing of his parents down the hall. Silence had become not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything still listening back. Breakfast resumed its usual clatter, cereal, spoons, the occasional spill, but the room wore gentleness like a new coat that fit. The father caught himself humming without realizing it. The mother laughed more easily. The boy still spoke of simple things, clouds that looked like boats, the neighbor's cat learning patience, the way bread toasted faster when you remembered to thank it. Nothing had changed in the order of events, yet everything had changed in the order of meaning. The pastor came once more, carrying no bag, no oranges, no plans. He sat at the table and let the stillness pour itself between them. "You've been teaching us, little one," he said. The boy tilted his head. "He was the teacher," he corrected softly. "I just listened." The pastor nodded. His eyes shimmered, but not from grief. It was joy seasoned with reverence, the joy that trusts itself to stay quiet. The community, too, had returned to its rhythm, but with subtler footsteps. People greeted each other more slowly. Arguments ended in laughter that felt like repentance. A grocer, who once scolded his apprentices, now touched their shoulders and said, "We have time." A teacher discovered her students whispering prayers before tests, not for grades, but for calm. The bus driver turned off his radio between stops, so the morning could hum its own gospel. No one spoke of miracles anymore. The word felt too loud. What remained was something older than explanation, a shared hush that followed people home and reminded them how to breathe kindly. When the baker kneaded his dough, he thought of the boy's sentence. He said the dough is a world that needs gentle turning. Each loaf became a sermon. When a carpenter sanded a rough edge, he whispered, "Round is kinder." When an old woman lifted her cup of water, she said under her breath, "Thank you for being what you are." Weeks passed, and the boy's words became fewer, not from fear or weariness, but because the message had rooted itself where words no longer needed to grow. He still smiled at strangers with the serene courage of one who has already forgiven them for not understanding. The mother found him once in the garden, crouched beside a snail. "He moves slow," the boy said. "That's how you don't miss love." She knelt beside him, realizing the truth was now part of the soil. Sometimes, at night, the family would gather on the porch, wrapped in the same blanket of quiet that had first visited them. They spoke of nothing important, stars, the weather, the neighbor's dog, but beneath their sentences ran the current of something holy that refused to be named. The father would reach for the boy's small hand, and in that touch he felt the long apprenticeship of gentleness continue. The pastor began ending every service the same way, by waiting. No benediction, no final hymn, only the kind of silence that allows gratitude to choose its own shape. The congregation would sit, breathing in the hush, and then disperse without noise, each person carrying home a fragment of that peace. People called it the quiet blessing. It spread faster than any sermon ever had. Seasons shifted, leaves reddened and fell. Snow came timidly, as if uncertain it was welcome. Through it all, the small house remained steady, unremarkable, full of ordinary chores that now felt like liturgy. The table held new scratches and still smelled faintly of bread. The window still caught the same square of light each afternoon. Holiness, having found a home, did not need to announce itself again. The boy grew, as all children do. His legs stretched, his sentences thickened, his laughter deepened. Yet now and then, in the middle of some trivial moment, tying his shoes, stirring his cocoa, he would pause, eyes far away but gentle. He liked when people remembered, he'd whisper, and then return to being a child. The mother kept her notebook. The last line she ever wrote in it was simple. "He taught us to stay findable." After that, she closed it for good, not to forget, but because some lessons finished by being lived. The father, who once repaired things to keep them from falling apart, learned the holier craft of letting things rest as they are. He said little, but every nail he drove found its rightful place. Every door he hung opened softly. Sometimes, when twilight folded itself over the town, a faint scent of olive wood or warm bread would return. People didn't chase it. They nodded to it, grateful. The baker would stop kneading and smile. The teacher would pause at her desk and breathe. The pastor, reading late, would close his Bible and whisper, "You're still here, aren't you?" And the silence, faithful as ever, would answer by staying. The house that once held the vigil now belonged to its own peace. The table was still, the floor familiar. The walls memorized the laughter that once healed them. The family lived quietly, neither hiding nor boasting, simply available. They had become what they once waited for, and the town, ordinary, scarred, forgiven, moved forward with new gravity. Fences were repaired more gently. Roads seemed to hum with less complaint. People looked at one another longer, not to analyze, but to remember. He learned to be small, so no one would be afraid to come near. In the stillness that lingered, eternity felt less like a distant realm and more like the air itself, an invisible nearness, warm and patient, folding itself into every breath. The mystery had not left. It had simply stopped needing to arrive. If you stood on that street now, you might smell the same quiet bread, or hear laughter behind the windows, or sense a peace that does not advertise itself. And if you felt a hand on your heart, not heavy, only reminding, you would know. The hidden years are not over. They continue wherever love learns to stay small enough to be found. So the story rests. The child, the family, the town, all folded into a silence that speaks without sound. And perhaps that is the truest miracle of all, that God still chooses small tables, ordinary mornings, and listening hearts. Stay a little longer. Sometimes peace itself is the voice you were waiting for.